Khalil M. Habib is Associate Professor of Politics at Hillsdale College, where he teaches political philosophy and American political thought. Dr. Habib has co-edited 2 books, The Soul of Statesmanship, Shakespeare on Nature, Virtue, and Political Wisdom, and Cosmopolitanism in the Age of Globalization.
All right, well, thank you very much for the invite, Dr. Wheatland. I agreed to this talk months ago. I didn't know who was on the panel or what they would be speaking on, but to prove to you that an invisible hand always brings panelists together, mine is on Montesquieu, and it follows directly after Dr. Driscoll's talk. And what I wanted to do was more or less introduce how I introduce Montesquieu to the study of the American founding. And at Hillsdale College, every student has to take our course, U.S. Constitution. And it's a big reader, and it has selections from all sorts of original texts. But I always teach Federalist 1 through 10, and I can't do more because of the constraints on time and the amount of material that we cover. But I always introduce his thought after we finish Federalist 9 and 10 for obvious reasons. It's the first time the Federalists mention a philosopher by name explicitly, and that, of course, is Montesquieu. The only other name they mention, if memory serves, is Polybius. But the first political philosopher is Montesquieu. And here's how Federalist 9 begins, because it's quite difficult to introduce students to Montesquieu. I just discovered that Dr. Bailey and I were actually in the same graduate seminar back in 1998 on Montesquieu, and so talk about a small world. And that was a very difficult course. It tried to cover almost all of the spirit of the laws, and there's an occupational hazard in doing that, because Montesquieu raises one theme, drops it, then picks it up again, and it's not clear where he's going. He warns us at the beginning of the spirit of the laws that it might seem like a shoddy work and arbitrarily moving from one theme to the next. So the way I like to do it is pull all the threads where Montesquieu talks about the deficiency or the problems of ancient republicanism and why the English Constitution, which he describes as a republic hidden inside of a monarchy. And when students ask me, what on earth does that mean? I say, well, think about Burger King. Here's a monarch who says you can have it your way. Right there, a very Republican theme, very democratic. It's something like that. It has a separation of powers within it, and it does have a monarchy, but it has these intermediary powers that help to check any possibility of a centralized government. So here's how Federalist 9 begins. It is impossible to read the history of the petty republics, meaning small republics, of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated and at the rapid succession of revolutions by which the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. And in that same Federalist paper, they go on to say that the problem with this unresolved problem of ancient republicanism, they're small, prone to instability, factions, is that the partisans of monarchy who think, you see, human beings can't self-govern. You need something like a centralized authority to clamp down on all of these factions, is that there's no case that can be made for why you would want to bring about some kind of republic in the modern world. But then they go on and indicate that there's been progress made in the science of politics, namely Montesquieu. And they mention, for example, the separation of powers, representative government, a confederated republic, and then subsequent Federalist papers will go into each of the separated powers. But if you take a look at the Book 11, Chapter 6 of the Spirit of the Laws, where Montesquieu explicitly devotes his time to the English Constitution, you're immediately struck by the fact that he's constantly comparing England to ancient Rome. And so when I first came across that, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, because Montesquieu also has a book that was published 14 or 15 years prior to that called Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and Their Decline. I wonder if there's a connection there to be made. And if you turn to that book, Montesquieu does reference many times England and France, both contemporary England and contemporary France. And it's obvious from that book in the Romans, he's actually illustrating very vividly what the problem of ancient republicanism was. So it's a bit difficult, but if you're introducing Montesquieu in the context of the American founding, you can at least look at the first half of the book on the Romans and then connect it to Book 11, because Book 11 does presuppose you have a working knowledge of how Montesquieu treats the ancient republic. So what was the cause of Rome's greatness and its decline? That's the title. And of course, it begs the question, well, what was it? And it turns out, ironically enough, that the cause of Rome's greatness was the very cause of its decline. So what was its primary cause? He tells us in the book of the Romans that the primary cause of its greatness was a principle, and that's a term that Montesquieu uses throughout the Spirit of the Laws. When he looks at a monarchy, he says the fundamental spring or principle of a monarchy is honor. And in a republic, it's love of equality, love of the homeland. And in a despotism, the spring or principle is fear. The ruler rules according to fear and centralizes authority in all branches of government. And Montesquieu thinks no matter what kind of government you have three powers, period. You have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The question is, how are they organized? In a despotism, one man controls all. And then in a monarchy and in a republic, they're dispersed. And in a monarchy, Montesquieu says, in how he defines a monarchy, it's not just simply a king ruling. It's a monarchy in which intermediary powers, such as the nobility, even the church or religion, are pushing up against and resisting centralization of power. But what's amazing about this particular book, though, he uses that same term, principle. But Rome, classical Rome in that book, isn't actually governed by any of those principles. None of those springs are really there, except one that he doesn't identify again in the Spirit of the Laws. So what was the principle of ancient Rome, according to the book on the Romans? The principle of continual warfare. And he says that that was the principle that animated ancient Rome. If you look at how he looks at the classification of regimes in the Spirit of the Laws, you don't see that. So you're thinking, well, how can that be? Well, because he thinks that he is advancing an improvement on ancient republicanism. He needs to show us what the problem of ancient republicanism is so that he can show us what the solution of it is. So that is the relationship between these two books. So you need to identify what the problem. So why is the principle of constant warfare a problem? Montesquieu says that from the very outset of the book, that you can't look at ancient Rome from contemporary eyes. You can't look at their ruins, you can't look at Cicero, and you can't look at the late Republic or the early Empire and really identify what was its original cause. He says you have to go back to when they were ruled by kings and when the triumph as an institution was introduced to further continue the quest for domination, expansion. And so the principle of constant warfare meant that the Romans had to institute ways to constantly keep the love of expansion going. And to the extent that they established institutions, it was always to serve their relentless desire for conquest. And so that principle led to its greatness, but then consequently, that very same principle led to its decline, because what ended up happening is that its constitution was not able to sustain its massive territory. In other words, there was no way for the Romans to have a confederated republic. It was not established for stability. So when you turn to chapter 9 in the book on the Romans, typical Montesquieu, the title is Two Causes of Rome's Ruin. And then as you read it, he says like there's 12. Typical Montesquieu, you're like, wait a minute, what happened to the two? Here's what happened to them. And his basic point in that book is that Rome's initial institutions, after they expelled Tarquin, was to have two proconsuls, annual rotation, so that the citizen soldiers wouldn't become too attached to a general, and there was some kind of check against that ambition. They kept the practice of triumphs, which means you conquer a people, and then you get to parade them as slaves, and then there was a distribution of all of the booty that they accumulated in that conquest. And if they took over a people, they assimilated them into the military. They gave them the same rights and privileges, just shy of full citizenship. But what happened was, when Rome, precisely because of the principle of continual war, it necessarily leads to a military empire. And Montesquieu is not a fan of military empires, and he thinks that he can disabuse us of this notion if we study the ancient Romans. To prove this point, when Montesquieu turns in chapter 9 to the two primary causes, he identifies these two, but there's like an infinite qualification of causes, so just be aware. If you haven't read that, you're going to be puzzled why he enumerates like 5, 6 on one page and then another 5. He says the following: when the domination of Rome was limited to Italy, the republic could easily maintain itself. So right there, the emphasis on its constitution. Its constitution was suited only for a small territory. It was only suited for a small republic. As soon as it expanded, the institution wasn't scalable, and it started to fall apart. But he reminds us of what made it so great to begin with. When it was small and limited to a small territory, a soldier was equally a citizen, and that is crucial. The strength of early Rome was in the fact that citizen soldiers ran things. They were vested in the country. When they fought, they were fighting for their family, for their homeland, for their territory. Every council, he says, raised an army, and other citizens went to war in their turn under their successor. So number two of their cause for greatness is that there were annual rotations. This actually continued the quest for domination because you had only 1 year to prove you were worthy of that office. And so they said they wanted to do great enterprises, and the way to do that was to continually expand and to prove your mettle. And then, of course, once it expanded, the citizen soldier was no more. The annual consulship rotation was no more. But then he goes on, since the number of troops was not excessive, care was taken to admit into the militia only people who had enough property to have an interest in preserving the city. So there were a property qualification. You had not only to be a citizen, but you had to have property. Later, in Romans history, they opened the floodgates when they were so big that they were introducing non-citizens into the military. It became too large, too multicultural, and that third aspect of their greatness started to become undermined. And then he says, finally, the Senate was able to observe the conduct of the generals and remove any that they thought might have violated any of their duty. So in other words, there was Senate oversight. There was a close relationship between the military and the Senate. So there were sort of some kind of crude separation of powers, or at the very least, some kind of checks. But here is the danger that Montesquieu warns about: empire. Empire for the Romans was only possible through their military. And he says the following: when the legions crossed the Alps and the sea, the warriors who had to be left in the countries they were subjugating for the duration of several campaigns gradually lost their citizen spirit. That's astonishing. So one of the lessons that Montesquieu draws there is that whatever you do in foreign affairs or foreign policy will eventually come home to roost in your own nation. So what was the significance of crossing and going beyond a small territory and a small republic? For one, that first cause of their greatness, the citizen soldier, was destroyed. You couldn't distinguish a citizen from a soldier in ancient Rome. As soon as the military took on a role unique to it, and now the Senate had less and less oversight, certain consequences began to happen. Citizens were no longer on short leashes, citizen soldiers. And the wars now would take decades and from far distant places. And so familiarity with one's own started to weaken. It was just simply too big. And the first thing he notes is that the citizen spirit died. Well, where did it go, though? It had to have transformed into another direction. And he says, and the generals who disposed of armies and kingdoms sensed their own strength and could obey no longer. So in other words, something like a military-industrial complex emerged within Rome, where the military, which was essentially the main cause of its growth because the principle of constant war was lodged within that organization, the generals also lost any sense of the common good, any sense of Rome. They essentially started to become cults of personality. And so he says the following: the soldiers then began to recognize no one but their general, to base all their hopes on him, and to feel more remote from the city. They were no longer soldiers of the Republic, but those of Sulla, Marius, Pompey, and Caesar. And so there you have it. Empire, the kind that Rome exemplified, was a republic that was no more. It had all of the features of a republic, but once it expanded, it wasn't able to scale those checks. And as soon as the military and the civilian world was split, and there was no connection anymore with military interest and civilian interest, Rome became essentially a tyranny. And then there's one other problem. He says that's one major cause. The second is that the empire, the greatness of the empire ruined the republic because the greatness of the city was destroyed. Now, what does he mean by that? He says that once Rome became so big, it no longer had a unified Roman vision. It had all these different cultures from different parts of the world. And when Rome in its past was unified, at least with respect to what its end was, liberty, no people can conquer us. We conquer, we dominate, we are free. There was no longer, he says, a unity of vision. And so consequently, the rise of demagoguery and factions started to get a grip on Rome's civilian life. He says the following: after this, Rome was no longer a city whose people had but a single spirit, a single love of liberty, a single hatred of tyranny, a city where the jealousy of the Senate's power and the prerogatives of the great, always mixed with respect, was only a love of equality. Once the peoples of Italy became its citizens, each city brought to Rome its genius, its particular interests, and its dependence on some great protector. What were the consequences? And here I think Montesquieu articulates, in addition to the principle of constant war, what else made Rome great. He says the following: the distracted city no longer formed a complete whole. And since citizens were such only by a kind of fiction, so the first thing is they couldn't define a citizen anymore. Citizenship was just a legal term that had no meaning. Too many different clans, too many different interests, too many different groups around the world had their own competing vision of what a citizen was. And so he goes on, and since they no longer had the same magistrates, the same walls, meaning they were confined to one area, he says they no longer shared the same gods. So there, Montesquieu indicates, as he indicates later in the Spirit of the Laws, that religion does play a civic role, and it should unite a city and not disunite it. But various different peoples came from different parts of the world with different conceptions of religion. And so the unity that made it great initially started to fray. The same temples, which is interesting, because the temples are where communities were formed. Just as today, if you go to a church, a synagogue, the temple, you end up forming a community centered around your own religion. But now they have various different temples, and then they no longer have the same graves, meaning they no longer shared a common ancestry. And what was the result? And I'll leave you with this. He says, as a result, the ambitious entered cities so that they could disturb voting. They recognized that all these different groups now form voting blocks, and so they encouraged open borders even more. And then they decided that they would start demagoguing and rise to power. And eventually, this led to civil wars and social wars. So what is then his solution in the Spirit of the Laws? First of all, Montesquieu thinks that the principle of constant warfare is a self-defeating principle. The point of the book on the Romans is to show that if that is the foundation of your government, you are necessarily going to have to become a military empire. And the moment you're a military empire, you don't have the institutions of a republic, the scaffolding that can maintain it. So in the Spirit of the Laws, when you finally get to what he's talking about with the English Constitution, it's not just simply limited to Book 11. You have to see it in light of Book 20, which is on commerce. What did England do, at least the England of his time, that was different? What England did is it had a separation of powers, and in particular, an independent judicial system. And so he spends a lot of time talking about juries. And he thinks that of all the branches of government, this is the one that should be the most democratic. Juries should be chosen according to one's peers. The accused should have the presumption of innocence and should have the veto on who the jurors are, or even the judge. And so this infinite number of checks created what Montesquieu describes as liberty in Book 11. And I have to just read you this, because he builds on Locke, and then he improves him in a different direction. Chapter 3, what is liberty? This might as well come out of John Locke. It is true that in democracies, the people seem to do what they want, but political liberty is in no way consistent with doing what you want. That's Locke's distinction between license and liberty. But where is it different? Like Locke, he wants a separation of powers, but with Montesquieu, the judiciary is entirely independent. So tell me if this doesn't sound familiar. To have liberty, he says, and so that one cannot abuse power. Power must check power by the arrangement of its institutions. And of course, anyone familiar with the Federalists knows that they'll hear that formula repeated. And then eventually what he does is he gets to how England was able to get its constitutional house in order. And here's his definition of liberty. I've got 1 minute, I'll make it really quick. Liberty is the opinion of one's security, that they no longer have to fear the arbitrary abuse of power. What he means is a constitution is set up in such a way that there are so many checks that you don't have to fear arbitrary decrees ruining your property and your rights. When he gets to the commerce, he says commerce can only exist, prosperity can only take place when a nation is free. That kind of expansion, commercial expansion, under a properly guided liberal, democratic, and republic constitution leads to prosperity and a different kind of expansion, one that can be conducted through trade and prosperity. And that can be scalable. That can be a confederated republic. But to see how that solution works, you have to first begin with his book on the Romans. So, thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.